Would you pray with me? Lord, so fill our hearts with your love and grace, that we may be reflections of that same love and grace, even in the midst of all the weeds of this world. Amen. Where in the world did all these weeds come from? If you've looked at our back patio lately, you've probably asked that same question. It seems as though overnight the weeds sprung up and have threatened to take over the place. It's a question we've asked ourselves. Where did all these weeds come from? But really, it's a question that we've all asked at some point. We may not have used those words. It may not have sounded just like that, but we've all asked the question nonetheless. Maybe we asked that question when we watched a deadly virus totally consume our world. When our nation confirmed what many of us already suspected, that we're more engrossed in political division than we are concerned with the health and welfare of others. When we've made something as simple and common sense as wearing a mask a marker of our political proclivities. Some arguing that it tramples on our right to do as we please, while others are quick to pass judgment. And yet no one is really slowing down to listen, to actually speak with one another, or to listen to one another. When we become emblematic of an issue, and we no longer are seen as individual human beings made in God's image, we may very well ask ourselves, where did all these weeds come from? Maybe we've asked that question each time we see another news report, when we see another cell phone video of an unarmed black person being killed by police, when we've taken to the streets to place blame, whether it's blame against the systems of injustice that have led to such behavior, or it's blame against those who protest and incite violence and destruction. When we again come to stand for an issue and fail to see the other individual made in God's image, we're again forced to ask the question, where did all these weeds come from? Maybe we've asked that question this week, where only 145 miles from here, our federal justice system has resumed the practice of executing federal prisoners, resumed government-sanctioned murder, reinforced the sort of eye for an eye, do to me and I'll do to you form of retributive justice that Jesus opposed and declaimed. Where did all these weeds come from? We live in a world in which our cultural forms of religion have given us the false assumption that when we're good, when we do what we're supposed to do, when we work hard, we'll get everything just the way we want it. And if we don't get the results we expect, if it doesn't turn out the way that we want it to, then one of two things must have happened. Either we didn't work hard enough, or someone else is to blame. Well, that, my friends, that's a lie that we've told ourselves so often that we may take it as gospel truth, but it's still a lie. It's still an illusion, and it's certainly not the worldview that Jesus teaches us. But in this morning's gospel, it's the worldview of the slaves. Master, they ask, did you not sow good seed in your field? Well, of course he did. They know that, otherwise they wouldn't be so surprised to find all those weeds sprouting up in the midst of the wheat. The presence of those weeds, you see, have shattered their illusion of the way things were supposed to happen. Where did all these weeds come from? There's more than just concern in their voice. Can you hear it? If you listen, there's a sense of fear, a sense of urgency in their question. They want to know what happened. And more importantly, They want to know who did it. Who's the culprit responsible for this act of sabotage? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we probably want to know that as well. When we discover the weeds growing in our own fields, that's what we look for, isn't it? We want an explanation. We want someone to blame. We want someone that we can hold accountable. We want someone to be punished for causing us trouble. After all, isn't that what our society has taught us to expect? Isn't that what we read on so many of our social media posts and hold on to in our privately held opinions? But this isn't the way of Jesus. It's not what God is interested in for us. In fact, in this morning's gospel, Jesus doesn't even give it much thought or attention. He certainly is less interested in entertaining the slaves' speculations than we are. An enemy has done this, Jesus tells us. That's it. End of sentence. He doesn't provide us with an explanation. Why did the enemy do this? He doesn't identify the enemy. That's not important to Jesus. He doesn't give the slaves instructions to search out and to find this enemy so that he can be punished, as society and the law would have allowed. Our desire to seek out and name the culprit, our desire for an explanation, our desire to hold the enemy accountable brings us to an uncomfortable truth that we neither like nor want to accept. It's the challenge of Jesus' gospel message, and we hear it today just as we did in last week's gospel on the parable of the soils, as Jesus confronts us with and challenges the way we think and see and act and live. It's a challenge that calls us to become more than who we think we are, perhaps even to become more than who we think we're capable of becoming. And it's a challenge that we're confronted with every time we encounter the weeds in our lives and in our world. The truth is that our lives, our world, is a field in which goodness grows, but where evil is also present. It's a field filled with life created in God's image, but there's also death. It's a field of immeasurable joy, but there's also sorrow present, sometimes at the same time. It's a field in which we find all those things we want growing alongside all those things we don't want. The wheat and the weeds, they stand together in this world of ours and even within our own lives. And this, Jesus tells us, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's the gospel message. It's the good news for us that among all the weeds growing all around us and even in us, even despite of these weeds, God's kingdom is still there. Just as the weeds growing on my patio, they do not overcome God's kingdom. They don't destroy it or make it somehow absent. The kingdom is still there. It may not be the fullness of God's kingdom, which we should continually be seeking, but it is the kingdom nonetheless. But what about those weeds? Those weeds of divisiveness and injustice and anger. What are we to do about them? Certainly we should be doing something to root them out and to destroy them. Not according to Jesus. He tells us to let them grow together until the harvest, until the end. That, my friends, is a challenging call. It doesn't make any sense to us. How can we allow such a thing? After all, weeds are bad, and the wheat is good. We have to do something. We have to protect the wheat. We have to take a stand. We have to draw a line in the sand and establish some boundaries. The slaves asked the master, "Do you want us to pull up the weeds?" "No," Jesus answers. You see, the roots of the weeds have become entangled with the roots of the wheat. And if they were to pull up the weeds, they would uproot the wheat along with them. The weeds that Jesus is speaking about is sometimes called false wheat. It grows with the wheat. It looks like the wheat. Their roots intertwine with the roots of the wheat. The difference between the wheat and the weeds is not readily apparent. But by the time the weeds are identified, well, it's too late. Separating the wheat from the weeds is not as clear-cut. It's not as black and white as our social media posts, as our politicians, as our news media, even our own personal opinions would have us to believe. See, there's a fine line between standing up and demanding justice and judgment. It is one of our Christian obligations to speak up against injustice whenever and wherever we see it. But it is never our place to make judgment. It's not our place. It's not our prerogative to uproot those who we see as weeds. This, my friends, is something that Jesus is very clear about. Let them grow together until the harvest, Jesus says. You see, he's more interested in growth than he is in extermination. Jesus is willing to wait and to be patient. And if we really are to call ourselves followers of Jesus, as those seeking to follow his way, well, then we too must wait and be patient amongst the weeds of our lives. And while we're patiently waiting, let's not get too excited about the end of the parable. Let's not celebrate and revel in the idea that the end is coming and that Jesus will come as some sort of a divine weed killer. Like most of his parables, Jesus didn't intend this to be taken literally, although he did intend for it to be taken with absolute seriousness. So what are we to do? Do we just sit here and do nothing and wait? Well, that's not what Jesus is saying either. There's plenty of work for us to do, but it's work that will challenge us to our core. The words that have been translated into English as Jesus saying, "Let them grow," can also be translated as Jesus saying, "Forgive them." They're the same words Jesus spoke from the cross on Good Friday, just before he gave up his life breath. Father, forgive them. Even then, even as he hung on the cross, beaten and tortured and humiliated, Jesus is unwilling to pull up the weeds. The good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ, that leaves no place for Christian vigilantes, not by our actions or by our words, not against another soul made in God's image, not even against ourselves. Well, what are we to do? Jesus commands us to love. Love God. Love yourself. Love your neighbor. Love your enemy. Are we to forgive the weeds? Are we to love the weeds, even those weeds that have thorns and draw blood? Remember when I warned you that Jesus' gospel is always challenging? Well, then the answer is yes. Yes, forgive them. Yes, love them. Maybe, just maybe, this is how the wheat begins to disentangle its roots from those of the weeds. It begins to show itself as the true wheat, and not the weeds. Perhaps, love and forgiveness, or what life in God's kingdom, in this field mixed with wheat and weeds, what it's really about. Amen.